sections, infrastructure for fragmented cities, today's session focuses on infrastructural challenges in Southeast Asia. The Infra Plus webinar series is convened by Dr. Deliana Osifova, who's my PhD supervisor. Thank you, Deliana, for inviting me to chair this session. Infra Plus webinar series aims to identify links between context-specific infrastructural challenges, approaches to their solution, and universal mechanisms towards improved sustainability. This series will be running up until July on weekly basis. So please feel free to register on Eventbrite if they are of any interest to you. Today, we have 5 wonderful speakers who will be presenting on Southeast Asian cities with a focus on water, sanitation, and transport infrastructures. Each presentation will be for 20 minutes, followed by a 5-minute discussion. In the end, we'll have 15 minutes for overall discussion. If you have an immediate question which cannot wait, then please feel free to post it in a Q&A box. We'll be recording the session and it will also be going live on YouTube. Please feel free to ask questions anonymously in the chat box or the Q&A box. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Amita Bhide. Professor Bhide is the Dean of School of Habitat Studies at Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. With nearly 20 years of teaching experience at TIS, she has played a significant role in setting up the School of Habitat Studies and in designing the master's program at Urban Policy and Governance. One of the inaugural fellowship recipients of India-China Institute, Amita Bhide has an equal commitment to teaching and research. Keeping her research focus centered on urban poverty alleviation, slum sanitation, affordable housing, slum rehabilitation, and urban governance, Professor Bhide has contributed to counter existing narratives on the role of state in governing Mumbai and other small and medium towns in Maharashtra. She has also actively researched and engaged in broader issues, including urbanization, decentralization, and state of urban local bodies, community participation, gendered governance, and regional development. Over the years, she has led high-profile academic projects involving national and international collaborations. I have had the privilege of working with her for past 7 years. Welcome, Professor Bhide. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Purva, and happy to be here. Thanks to Deliana as well. So let me go right to my presentation. So what I'm going to really talk about today is that there was a period when in India, especially urban India, we constantly talked about non-access to sanitation, just the sheer paucity of toilets, sanitation infrastructure. But now I think the scenario has considerably changed. This does not mean that there are no exclusions, but just that the form of exclusions have changed. In order to take you through this, I want to first take you to what does informal settlement or basti actually mean in Indian cities. There are multiple perspectives linked to this. So the first meaning of a basti is where there are often non-property claims developed through occupancy and in an incremental manner. This is one of the very, very critical ways in which urbanization actually happens. Seen from the top, informal settlements are called slums, and the shift in definitions that you see in these official definitions is also very interesting. So in 1956, with the Slum Clearance Act, the definition of a slum was densely crowded areas with unhygienic living conditions that are a threat to public health and morality. To more current definitions which are used in census as well as in policy, as any area that is declared as a slum by a competent authority is a slum. So this really in some ways gives us an insight into how today informality is actually becoming a dominant strategy of city making, not just by the powerless, but actually by the powerful, that it is becoming a part of state repertoire of flexibility from constitutional commitments which are considered to be non-flexible. In some ways, therefore, informal settlements are becoming frontiers of developmental warfare in cities for varied purposes. And therefore, this first understanding of non property claims versus this informal settlements as frontiers of developmental warfare is the overall context within which we also discuss the changing approach to informal settlements as well as the changing approach towards sanitation services. And for this, I first wanted to just give some insight into when we talk about informal settlements, what is their geography? And I'm just taking the example of two cities, which can be said to be broadly, I would say, representative of several other Indian cities, though not fully so. Every city definitely has these specificities. But one of the things that these two maps of Hyderabad and Mumbai linked to their slum shows basically indicates that informal settlements are spread through all parts of the city and definitely also in central, highly valued areas of the city, and not they are not just a peripheral phenomenon. Now, this has significant implications today when we think about a policy for sanitation. We also need to see these changing sanitation approaches in the broader aspect of how urban policy itself had changed. For a very long time, approach towards city provisioning and service provisioning was dominated. I would say it was like an engineering approach where networked sewer systems were seen as a goal, where the public sector or city governments, state governments, national governments, where they actually led the growth of services. There were master plans which were prepared for every city for land use, and then these determined actually also a master plans for sewage, for drainage, for water supply, and so on and so forth. Within all of this, informal settlements had no place. They were actually seen as sites to be cleared. Then, in the 1970s, mid 1970s, came the entire phenomenon of a dual city approach, and where the ambition towards creating networked sewer systems was actually moderated, and septic tanks, on site facilities, disposal facilities began to be seen as options. Okay. Here too, also what we see very interestingly is that there is a rest of the city which consists of tax-paying citizens versus a political city which deploys extremely different strategies. What are the approaches towards sanitation then here? Basically, it is as part of an overall humanitarian service approach to settlements. So you have low cost sanitation schemes, and these gradually gave way in the 1990s to more community sanitation programs in the form of Nirmal Bharat Abhiyan. The Please note here the ratios for overall provisioning of these toilets per population. The third approach, which is actually the much more contemporary approach, which has come into being after 2000, or I should say after 2005 to be more correct, one basically sees that there is a lot more emphasis about the city as a spectacle. And when I'm talking about city as a spectacle, here there are different dimensions of infrastructure and particularly sanitation infrastructure, which means that A infrastructure, including sanitation, is seen as a driver of growth. Therefore, then there is an overall emphasis on rankings of cities. Sanitation becomes part of an overall ease of living, where aesthetics become important, where the aesthetics become also part of an overall competition to attract capital investment to a city. And within this, then one sees that the emphasis is much more on open defecation free cities, then carrying out what are called Swachhata surveys or cleanliness surveys and rankings of cities based on that. One also sees that there is some bit of investment by corporates into the sanitation sector. uh, Overall approach towards informal settlements is that there is large scale rehousing attempts in especially the larger cities, whereas in smaller cities there is much more acceptance of individual toilets. So now in these two contexts, let us look at what were the conventional exclusions. This photograph here is of a typical what are called shared toilets or public toilets, or now more recently called community toilets, where the forms of exclusions are that there are too few toilets, there is no option but to share toilets, that is the only option available in informal settlements. There was no participation in where toilets would be located, nor in their design. The construction of toilets depended on elected representatives and how they had the discretionary ability to use their local area funds for construction of toilets. Provisions of maintenance were almost absent or sketchy, and therefore the condition of toilets used to be quite poor. Within a span of 5 to 10 years, there was a need to reconstruct toilets. Often, there is a denial of agency to the settlers because they only have free toilets. They would not be able to either contribute in any financial manner or to the implementation to their through their labor or participate in any other manner. There was also no data available. Now, if we look at current exclusions, however, there are multiple forms, and I'll quickly go through them. So, the first is a form of exclusion which happens through data. So, how cities get declared as open defecation free is a classic example of how then subsequent funds for toilet supply get denied to particular locations, how data gets manipulated, and despite the a situation on ground which says completely to the contrary, you still have cities getting very high ranks, and this a definite link between funds and data. This is a very, very important form of emergent exclusion. There is a second form which I think is equally critical. With thinking about open defecation free, there has come in a emphasis on behavior change, and shaming activities are now supported by the state. The photograph here that you see is taken from Indore, where armies of children are deployed in order to tease and shame women or men who engage in open defecation. And the kind of indignity and violence which is linked to these and the culture which is set off is something which is unimaginable. The second part of this same emphasis is also how, because of the lack of a toilet, there are evictions which are carried out in order to promote this image of clean cities. The third form is really where corporates get involved in the construction of toilets, especially in public spaces, not so much in informal spaces, but even the public toilets per se have a lot of significance for those segments of the poor who stay on streets, those people who work on the streets like vendors. Now, here what happens is in particular places which are visible, which are branded, you see these kind of corporate facilities. You can almost call this like a five-star toilet, like this similar toilet in the Gateway of India in Mumbai, which is a very touristy place and therefore visible. You also see other such amenities which have been constructed in more visible areas and called air conditioned toilets, bio toilets, and so on and so forth. The fourth form is really how the community itself, the word community, is being redeployed. Here, one sees that community participation is being equated to responsibility of maintenance, where community based organizations become mediators and they often set the terms of access, denying or providing access to migrants or to other more floating sections of population. These forms of community participation have also ensured that pay per use has now become an accepted principle. And accountability, however, is something which is not discussed. Another aspect of an emergent exclusion scenario is how household toilets still largely are being pushed into a tacit zone where there are a few supportive schemes, even under the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, where individual toilets are supported through a grant. However, these are highly contingent upon local governments, and there is actually no development of research or technology into how to provide sanitation options in dense brownfield areas. Uh, a final form that I will talk about is the role of the state. And within the role of the state, it's interesting to see how the state continues to keep its hold on built environment, but at the same time, there is a gradual withdrawal from actual provisioning. And instead, one sees a shift towards data and aesthetics management. You can see again in the photograph which is adjoining the kind of parameters how they are worked out, especially in terms of city rankings. And for this, the a workforce which was largely linked to public health has now actually become much more consultant driven and event manager driven. So what do all of these exclusions mean for residents of informal settlements? The first is that sanitation continues to be a difficult proposition as it was in the previous era. It, on the other hand, has become much more fragmented and uncertain. What one also sees is that one sees a withdrawal of the state in a very gradual manner, and currently it is largely happening through a hands off approach, which basically translates into a lack of accountability and instead violence in everyday life. What controls on sanitation facilities have mean is that there have been very few improvement or increase in options for the poor. On the other hand, there is a definite committed cost towards accessing sanitation services that the poor have to pay. Very interestingly, the meaning of participation, representation have all been inverted. And some of these vulnerabilities really showed up during the recent pandemics. So, just in terms of concluding thoughts, I think today what one is seeing in Indian cities is that there are many, many new forms and arenas of exclusion linked to sanitation that go beyond the previous issues of non access. Then sanitation actually continues to be a sector that denigrates the value of the basti as a place which is livable, where people can improve, which is self-made, which is auto-constructed, and which can have a existence within the city, which is becoming world class. Instead, it is a sector which continues to have the legacies of the past, while newer proposals or programs are actually making only cosmetic reforms. If you look at the overall space of sustainability, thinking about what happens to lighting, electricity supply, water provisioning, or for that matter, the treatment of wastewater, where is the sewage released, all of these sustainability practices actually remain only in an experimental space. So finally, when you neglect this kind of a sector, what happens is you basically create a space for policymakers and other vested interests for more drastic makeovers of the basti in the form of redevelopments or relocations. So it paves the way for a much larger exclusion than all the forms of exclusions that we talked about. Thank you.
Thank you for such a fascinating presentation. Uh, we have comment in the chat box, but if anyone wants to ask questions, now is the time, people. Uh, We have a small comment. Norma has commented. Norma, do you want to say it? I can't. I'll just read it out. Hello, everyone. Professor Amita opens very well the session with anthropological vision that makes a very good link with geography when addressing the Indian case. Thank you, Norma. Do we have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Takun.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I just wanted to know how to counteract these, how common are group community associations that try to do things on their own without depending on the state to provide for them? How much sort of local initiative is there?
So, should I respond immediately, Kurwa?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay. So thank you, Tarkin, for the question. So there are a fair bit of community initiatives. In fact, one of the photographs that I showed of household toilets, or there are other cases where community groups have taken over the maintenance of particular toilets. These are extremely interesting initiatives where community groups do show initiative in terms of improving their overall sanitation situation. In fact, there are some very interesting studies which actually show that when community groups have been able to assert their vision for household toilets, this has actually helped to prevent their participation or their giving into developer-led redevelopment schemes. So these are very, very interesting contestations, one can say. But on the other hand, I think there is a constant hegemonic push, I would say, to constantly renovate and to the control on all of these, especially shared toilets, continues to be that of the local governments and the state. Okay. So where there is a constant building, demolition, building, and this keeps uncertainty. And on the other hand, household toilets are pushed into as I said, a tacit zone. There are other cities, however. So in large cities where property markets are very high, sanitation situation is particularly worse, I would say. But on the other hand, in more medium scale cities, these agencies of communities have been able to express themselves much, much better.
Brilliant, thank you.
I had a small question or a comment. Mumbai has seen this legacy of slum sanitation program where it is much celebrated that how community has come together and there was a participation from the community to build public toilets. But now after 10 years or say 12 years of slum sanitation programs, many of the toilets are not in good condition. There have been seen that a lot of toilets are collapsing and people are dying in those public toilet collapses. So how does one, in recent Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, where there are these newer toilets which are being built, we could see something similar happening in next 10 years, or there might be some new things which would come up and people would lose their lives just by going to toilets. What should be in place to sort of keep a check on these kind of, I wouldn't say inhuman, but these kind of toilets infrastructure which is coming up, which is not really safe?
If an overall approach is to accept the existence of the basti, then a ongoing commitment, a continuous commitment to improving and maintaining the sanitation infrastructure is critical. Okay. We've seen why I deliberately showed the maps of Indian cities is to also show that the distance between sewer lines for the rest of the city and the informal settlements is not very high. And yet, often informal settlements are never linked to sewer lines. They are kept as on-site disposal facilities. And herein lies the key to also why there is a constant need for either emptying or repairing the septic tanks and so on and so forth. The second is their huge density, where the assumed proportions that there is going to be one toilet seat for 30 persons is something which is never realized in practice because there are too few toilets, right? And we have often seen in Mumbai that this proportion of use goes over 276 persons per toilet seat. Now, when there is this kind of density, it is bound to happen that the overall life of the toilet is going to be much smaller than the assumed 30 years. Do we have plans for therefore remaking them? Does the municipal corporation keep data of how many toilets, which toilets were built in which year? Do we geotag them? Is there a budgetary provision made for automatic improvement, reconstruction, repair of those toilets which have completed 10 years or more, or let's say 15 years and more? But we do not have this kind of a commitment at all. We still keep that within a discretionary kind of space. And I think therein really lies the key in order to either have more sustainable infrastructure, a more clear commitment towards this improvement.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There is one question in the Q&A section. Is India truly open defecation free as otherwise claimed by the politicians? How this can be achieved in real manner, especially in informal settlements?
How does one achieve open defecation free status? I think firstly by paying attention to those sections which are neglected completely. So today the proponents, or I would say the people who practice open defecation, I would put them in 2 or 3 categories. The first is really children, for whom no sanitation service or no sanitation option actually pays any attention at all. So they become like the really in a scenario of shared toilets, there is no sanitation provision for children, right? So if one has to include children, if one has to include senior citizens who have to access shared toilets at odd times during the night and find it very difficult, one has to ensure that one has to move towards much more, when I say shared, maximum between 8 to 10 households or so. So as close to the household toilet option as possible.
Thank you. And the last one, amazing presentation. How is the pandemic worsening this situation?
Okay. So in response to the pandemic, I would just say currently we did a assessment of over 408 sanitation blocks. And what we find is that in all these sanitation blocks, the CBOs, the community-based organizations, have continued to charge people on a pay-per-use basis even during the pandemic. So in a situation where livelihoods are getting lost, the corporations have continued to charge the CBOs for water, for electricity. In turn, the CBOs have continued to charge households. And so I think when we get into a very interesting scenario of you have to you self-exclude yourself from a sanitation facility because you can't afford to pay. This is one big scenario which the pandemic brings in. The other is, I think, just think in terms of the crowding. When we talk of 276 people to a toilet seat, waiting times which average from 30-40 minutes to an hour minimally, one is thinking of the toilet itself as a spreader space with no subsequent or periodic cleaning facilities, with no periodic hand washing facilities. And one can think about the enhanced vulnerability that that creates.
Okay, I am tempted to take one more question, so I will go ahead, executing my power as the chair. This question, Rohit,
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
First of all, thank you very much for a fascinating paper. In 1961, we decided in the case of Karachi that there would be no public toilets in settlements. And as a result, thousands of toilets are born in people's homes and buildings. Is that an option in the case of India?
Yeah. Dr. Hasan, I have been an admirer, a reader, a follower of the Orangi project, and thereafter, uh, and it is my dream in some ways to see whether one can actually operationalize this in Indian cities. Unfortunately, as I said, the smaller cities, some medium scale cities, these are options which are definitely emerging. But otherwise, even when people are trying to build toilets, so the photograph which I showed is of a settlement which has actually built household toilets. There are contractors emerging from people's practices which are actually building toilets. But the municipal corporation denies not only the existence of toilets, but it profiteers from it, collects money from it, because these are illegal according to them. Not only do they not support it, but further, they also criminalize the creation and construction of these toilets. So there are these two aspects which actually coexist. I would argue that definitely one can experiment with household toilets. At least in several settlements, one can do this, but we need a more positive local government approach towards this.
Sorry, I'll just add something. I think you need a weaker government like
Sir.
we have.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. One last question Rohit is asking. Thinking about the aspect of cosmetic makeover, can we say one of the way out is to shift the focus on retrofitting the existing toilets as well as along with building the new?
Yes, of course it is, but it doesn't suffice the need because there are too few toilets.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. We will move on. We are right in time. Next presentation is by Shubhagato Dasgupta. He is a senior fellow at Center for Policy Research and of the Scaling City Institutions for India Sanitation Initiative. His current research focuses on drinking water and sanitation in India and the world, with particular reference to flagship government programs and service delivery challenges in smaller cities. Other major areas of work include urban infrastructure and service delivery financing, housing and slum rehabilitation, urban sector public finance, and urban environmental infrastructure planning, management, and investment alternatives. Before coming to CPR, Shubhagato led the Support to National Policies for Urban Poverty Reduction Project, a collaboration between UK's Department of International Development and India Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation to develop pro-poor urban policies in 20 cities across 15 states. He has also worked on issues of urban development with a wide range of other public, private, multilateral, and non-governmental organizations, including Senior Urban Specialist at World Bank, Assistant VP at IDFC, and HUDCO. In addition, Shubhagato has also been developing on private sector participation projects in urban and drinking water programs in Eastern and Southern Africa for International Finance Corporation and Acumen Fund. Over to you, Shubhagato.
Thanks, Pura. That was a long introduction. You missed a few points. I'll tell you later. Thanks so much for that introduction. Delighted to be here. And means my talk today is is kind of going to explore what's happening on the other end of the urban spectrum in South Asia. What Professor Bhide talked about were mainly the metropolitan larger cities context. Here, there means, however, given that we are such a large continent almost, that there is lots more happening in urbanization and urban sanitation in the region. And means, in one sense, what seems to be happening from the context that this paper refers to, which is more or less diametrically opposite, the spectacle city of Mumbai or Hyderabad, is in these hidden smaller cities that are growing quite rapidly, and in this case, from one of our lower urbanizing states, wherein in some sense the developments are challenging very long-term and embedded problems bottom up. So much of the references that Professor Bhide talked about, it comes out of this long understanding, this historic evolution of what modern sanitation means, or what a city means, or what a city should have. And this, however, of course, has not been a norm for very long in global history. Most of for the longest period till around the 1850s, the global urban population was just 10% of the global population. It was only around the 1800s to 1850s that the urban areas started becoming a more significant habitation for global populations. And this was made viable very much due to the infrastructures that today are conceived to be what modern sanitation is all about. However, throughout this period, since the 1850s, over these 150, 70 years, the geographies and the populations that these infrastructures that are more or less the ideal, presented as the ideal for sanitation or around the world, have been in limited geographies in the West. Much of what is to be urbanized in the future, South Asia, East Asia, and Africa, is devoid of any of this, in spite of these 200 years of trying to push this modern infrastructure ideal. And of course, this has been theorized since. Martin Mellosi's The Sanitary City, the networked urbanism concepts, the discussion of these infrastructures not only being technical systems, but socio-technical systems, and the fragmentation that these have witnessed or the splintering urbanism that seems to be operating in the West currently, have kind of shaped a global theory of sanitation, urban sanitation more precisely, which seems to be quite far removed from realities of the future urbanizing spaces in the South. And so now some new literature has started acknowledging this, and there are talks about beyond the network city. There is some theoretical attempt to try and conceive of what the city looks like beyond networks. And in this talk, I'm not going to be focused on one city, but looking at the urban system of cities in India. And as very much like the globe till independence in the 1940s, much of our urban population too in South Asia and India too remained at a very steady level compared to the rural areas in general, which then saw a rise post-independence and post-liberalization too, right? But for this transformation, however, has been very uneven, right? Metropolitan cities are, as the graph below shows, have 63% connections, million plus cities, to sewerage as per the census 2011, while it was just the other way around for all cities smaller than that, right? And in understanding why sanitation is viewed to be only for larger cities in the south and driven by this heavy investment, heavy administration and huge costs driven out of an ideal that is no longer valid, is what we have been questioning in our research and in our practice, and this is what this talk is about. So, just to put it simply, it means over the period of these 150 years since all this modern infrastructure sanitary city ideal has been established, mainly in the West, the drivers for sanitation and the relevance of sanitation has evolved, right? So means it's not only is sanitation only a public health good, which it was in the 1850s in Western Europe. It is understood to have many other targets to meet, whether it's around climate change, around resource efficiencies, around the economic benefits of it, and of course, equity and dignity. These were considerations that were not so much at play when these modern large infrastructure projects developed in the West. So the ground playing field for much of what is to happen in places, in geographies which are yet urbanizing, and is going to be the driver for urbanization over the next 40, 50 years, is going to have to respond to a whole set of different challenges than discussed in the past. And of course, India is very much central in this transformation. So means when one looks at urbanization more widely in India, other than the large tail of these municipal million plus cities, there are arguably 8,000 other urban-like centers already through a very settled urban structure, right? Since the colonial period, with the establishment of what are our mega cities now, Chennai, Kolkata, Mumbai, and even Delhi for that matter, urbanization in India has been quite steady in that sense. There has not been too much of dislocation of larger cities becoming small, etc. There's been, because it's been relatively, means it's held its own and populations have grown. So along with these 8,000 locations now, what we also see is a lot of the rural population, close to 40% of the rural population is also living in what can be characterized as large dense villages, which need different sanitation arrangements than what pure rural might do. And this is around the environment and the treatment of how beyond toilets, how the waste is managed. Recently, of course, we are coming out of this Swachh Bharat mission, which did see some impact on the building of toilets. It's very debatable as to how sustainable and long-term these numbers will hold. But it is evident that much of the efforts have been towards building toilets and less around looking at the system as a whole, the sanitation system as a whole. In a long-term policy sense too, means it is only with the International Water and Sanitation Decade in the 1980s when sanitation got, sanitation in the global south got some recognition as an important development issue and found a place in international debates around and theory making in that sense. Before that, the way the colonial policies towards sanitation were very different from what was happening in the West at that point in time. Enclaves or smaller protected white neighborhoods were promoted in various ways across India's urban scenario. Since the international decade, however, there's been continuous efforts both from international agencies, but also a lot from national governments. And increasingly, there has been an increase in the efforts towards improving urban sanitation, which was primarily in the first phase viewed to be mainly a rural problem, and not so much emphasis was given to urban areas. Of course, India declared itself open defecation free, I guess, somewhere in 2019. But there is now a new Swachh Bharat mission too, trying to take on some additional tasks going forward. And within this, what I want to spend the rest of the slides is on understanding what really is happening in a state in India, which is among the more the lesser urbanized states. And this is built on practices that are happening on the ground. So in these cities, these are less than 100,000 population, but 100 in number as against the 5 municipal corporations in the state. And around 2013 to 2015, a range of policies and new research kind of brought in an understanding of how sanitation in these cities were currently organized and what incremental steps can be taken to make big changes to the sanitation scenario in these areas. So there was first a set of pilots done, along with learnings from which went into defining a policy for the state government, and which is now getting scaled up across the state. Essentially, it bases itself on mechanization of desludging, along with, of course, increasing the number of toilets and use of toilets in communities, and then treating it in these low-cost, smaller, gravity-based biological systems, which are low-cost and easy to maintain. So this new adoption of this new arrangement, which generally builds up on what was the logic that was what was already at play in these smaller cities, has of course not been a smooth process. It has involved relooking at not only policies but laws, new guidance, technical as well as institutional, on new mobilization around engaging with communities, etc. But in this case in Orissa, I mean, since they started off on this program, let's say in 2014 or so, or 2015 more accurately, over this short period of time, they have now managed to cover each of these small cities with one of these fecal sludge treatment plants, as it's called, and are providing FSM services in a citywide level, right? So they are being provided across all urban areas in the state. Further, means in in approaching the issue around increasing urbanization, the growth of these municipalities itself, the urban and rural departments in the state are collaborating on trying to extend these municipal services run by the municipality through municipal arrangements into neighboring rural areas. And with the increase in the use of toilets in rural areas, there is a demand for these kinds of services. And the municipality, in this case, Dhenkanal, has signed MOUs with 17 Gram Panchayats covering 100 villages to provide services to rural areas too, in an organized, planned manner, thereby trying to address issues around how these services will penetrate into rural geographies too. Means Orissa, urban scenario, therefore, has adopted this new model, moving away from what was the traditional model, which still serves all larger cities and metropolitan areas, and still seems to be the more important institution in most urbanized states. That of the provincial sewerage agency or the city sewerage agency, which either serves one city or serves all the cities in the neighborhood in the state, to a new kind of institutional arrangement where the state plays the role of regulator as well as a financier for the capital investment, and then the hands over these facilities to self-help groups, which are community groups organized through a set of laws and regulations, which then provide the services of desludging as well as treatment, wherein the users, other than in slums which are subsidized or actually in this case, fully borne by the state government budget, the rest of the households do pay for these services, though as of now, it is not yet, recovering all the operations costs as yet. But so what that leads us to see is that in these smaller geographies, very far away from our metropolitan vision of what modern sanitation is, a new kind of a set of institutions and arrangements are taking shape, which are more responsive to meeting the needs in the communities and geographies where these are based, challenging the notion and theories of the past. This, of course, has got increasing national legitimacy. The national programs, which till 2016, I guess, funded only sewerage projects, are now funding these kinds of arrangements too. The Swachh Bharat 2 is going to give this a big push. And earlier this year, the finance minister actually mentioned an allocation for these kinds of activities, even in the union budget. And this, some of this impact is already visible on the ground. And so the maps on the right-hand side kind of show that into 2016 in South Asia, for example, there were a handful, means 20 projects or 20 cities which were working towards this in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and some pilot projects in India. Right now, there are almost 120 cities that are very advanced stage of construction of these facilities and are operating these systems. However, this still is just 1% of where it has to go, because not only has it to cover all the 8,000 urban areas, but also has to provide services. These services are required in rural areas as toilet adoption increases. So this is still the beginning of this long process. Potentially, there are lots of each province, state government has to kind of define its own institutional pathways, though, and hopefully we'll hear a few more pathways in the next presentations. The urban and rural understanding of how these infrastructures and institutions are to work together has to be sorted out. And there are questions around what is the metropolitan impact of these alternative arrangements, and we do see some of it emerging. For example, many larger cities have been now formally trying to get on board and use co-treatment and fecal sludge management alongside their sewerage systems. There is some evidence of that, of these new arrangements influencing metropolitan cities too. But these parts need to be understood and further developed across this vast nation. I'll leave it there. Thanks so much, Purva.
Thank you, Shubhagato. It was quite insightful, especially someone who works on Mumbai. This was really amazing. Yeah, do we have questions? I'll wait for people to ask questions. But before that, I just wanted to sort of ask this thing where what was this motivation for the government, for the municipal corporation to sort of bridge between the two cities and then think about it from that scale? Because it's really difficult to look at a collaboration between the two branches also, like say sewer department and maintenance department don't talk to each other, but then here we're talking about collaboration at two city scales, which is, so what was the motivation behind it, or how did it happen?
So there are multiple processes are at play here. Fundamental to all of this is the acute requirement to serve these large geographies that remain unserved, right? Means in the case of Orissa, for example, means in an early urbanization phase, or not really early, it's very much middle of the line right now. It is not viable anymore politically to serve only larger cities and to keep smaller cities out of the window of these kinds of projects and development exercises. And if sewerage was to be pursued across the state in these 100 cities, it wouldn't have happened in another 20, 30 years. Yeah, the first sewerage systems in Orissa were being built right from, the first sewerage system in Puri took from 1998 to 2014 to construct. Yeah, and then too, there were lots of issues around the hotels not wanting to connect to the sewerage system because of the high charges associated with connections. And that they had established septic tanks, etc., and they had a system in operation already. So there is that motivation that drives it. But beyond that, there is lots of nitty-gritty stuff that has to be resolved. How does the accountability framework work? How will cost sharing happen, let's say, between rural and urban, between the different tiers of government? How much will it be loaded on to users? How will these self-help groups be trained, or will they be able to provide? What kind of risk cover do they need? There are lots of smaller hurdles that can all come in the way. But I guess the need to serve smaller settlements, smaller urban areas, accompanied by the mishaps and the infeasibility of extending sewerage as the only option, has been witnessed both by the state and by the government of India currently.
Mm-hmm. we have a lot of questions. Okay. We can go on with Sally. Would you want to ask your question? I will unmute you. Oh, I'm not able to unmute you. Okay, I will ask. Okay, I can unmute you. Hi, Sally.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi there. Thank you so much to both speakers so far for your excellent talks. I just wanted to ask a bit more about where manual scavengers fit into these shifting policies and programs. We know that the 2013 Act also acknowledged that sewer and septic tank emptiers working in very dangerous conditions can come under this categorization. But I just wanted to hear from you what you thought about how these workers are being affected by these shifting policies and programs, not only in large cities, but also in some of the smaller towns. Thank you.
Sure. Sure, thanks. I think the issue around sanitation workers is central to improving sanitation systems. In this particular case in Orissa, they've taken some very large, impactful steps towards working with sanitation workers from particular who, as you know very well, are from a particular set of castes and are very embedded. The service is very embedded within that social structure of society. Is that in one sense they have they have provided state protection to sanitation workers across the board. There's a new program of by the government itself. If you would want to check it out, it's called Garima. It essentially provides a whole set of social benefits and social protection benefits to sanitation workers. Yeah? So that's kind of the base understanding. But beyond that, with the improvements, let's say in construction standards, in trying to modernize or mechanize some of these services, it's a longish path. The infrastructure infrastructure remains to be very hazardous because it is all underground and trapped, and maintaining quality at the household level is a big constraint. There is some efforts going on to kind of prefabricate some of this infrastructure so that some quality is maintained. But the approach has been in this state, and possibly in kind of difference from what the government of India has done, or most other states have been doing, is in one sense, in quoted comment, means it's like a nationalization program for the sanitation workforce. So and this is supported by a large amount of funding too, in this particular case in Orissa. But it's an ongoing problem, and a problem in the sense that an issue to be understood better and tackled if we are to have any success in this area. Amita has a question. Can I go for that, Purva?
Yes, please.
Amita, the difference between Mumbai and Orissa is essentially this: that the institutions that have British past, colonial past, of these high hegemonic, supposedly perfectionist kind of heavy infrastructure-driven, flush it, forget it, and the water will take care of the rest kind of approach is not embedded in a state which is is just urbanizing, the political energy behind the protection of those hegemonic ideas is not as strong as it is in Mumbai, Delhi, or even at the Government of India level. So some of these battles are much easily won through more practical, sensible, and open discussions. Yeah, the overriding political motivation of wanting to deliver, extend services overrides these in these smaller cases. In Mumbai, of course, and in Delhi, of course, these institutions itself are sometimes more difficult and more long-term and regenerative in their own stuck-up manner, so to say, than the infrastructure itself, right? The infrastructure can be rebuilt. How do you rebuild some of these, institutions is still not very well understood for larger cities. But in these cases, the opportunity to try something different is much more prevalent in the environment.
Thank you. We'll take one or two questions. Tanvi Bhatkal has a question. I'll let her ask.
Hi, thank you. I guess closely related to Sally's question, I was just wondering sort of how at the local level existing marginalities, particularly around caste and sort of manual scavenging, are being negotiated, particularly in terms of creating these SHJs. So it would be nice to hear a little bit about sort of the institutional aspect at the local level.
So, prima facie, these self-help groups all belong to the same set of castes. Yeah, they are not that you have a whole set of Brahmins, a part of this self-help group doing sanitation work. Yeah, so that's not at all the case. It's very much belonging to the same sanitation worker community. However, in the past, sanitation workers were fully employed by municipalities. This is in the 80s, even up to the 80s. They were employed by the municipalities and therefore got a whole set of public sector benefits. In smaller towns, public sector benefits are at a higher economic level than private sector benefits. So they were pretty coveted jobs, which in this post-liberalization era was not feasible anymore, and there were lots of government action to ensure that that class of worker is not added to municipal staff, and there was a whole gap in engaging them. So this new arrangement kind of through a longer route gives a lot of these social benefits back to the community. It does not structurally change the caste system in these cities. Yeah. However, one must also understand that in this period between the 80s to now, 2015, many of these communities so sanitation work in the informal sector is still handled by them. Yeah, but it is more often than not a second occupation. Yeah, they are not only sanitation workers. They're running small shops, they're repairing and maintaining things, but they're also providing sanitation work. So that means it's a changing environment, and it is not. It's not that sanitation, any institutional arrangement of sanitation could have the capacity to change the caste structure, even in these smaller cities, in my understanding. I hope that gives you some more clarity, Tanvi, of what's happening on the ground.
Yes, thank you so much.
Shubhagato, there are many more questions in the Q&A. Will you be able to answer, type an answer for them? Because we are slightly running behind time.
Yeah, I'll type them out, but I don't see them. Are they visible to me? Should be visible to me.
Yeah, there is Q&A box in the right-hand side.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, I'll check that out. I'll
Perfect.
surely do.
Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, I see them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you. So we move on to our third speaker, Arif Hasan. He's a Pakistani architect, planner, activist, teacher, social researcher, and a writer. He studied architecture at Oxford Polytechnic and has worked in Europe has worked in Europe in architects' offices. And on his return to Karachi in 1968, he established an independent practice which slowly evolved into dealing with national and international urban planning and development issues. He has taught at Pakistani and European universities and lectured widely, both in North and South. Some of his current and previous involvements include documenting Karachi's history and development issues and process of social change in Pakistan. He's a visiting professor at Department of Architecture and Planning, NED University, Karachi. He's a chairperson at Urban Resource Center in Karachi, member of Executive Council of Asian Coalition for Housing Rights, Bangkok, member of Advisory Board of Environment and Urbanization, the Journal of International Institute of Environment and Development, UK. He's a member of UN's Advisory Group on Forced Eviction and a chairperson of Orangi Pilot Project and Research and Training Institute in Karachi. Welcome, Arif Hasan.
Well, thank you very much for having invited me, and also reading from a very old biodata of mine. I'm not half of these things, but it's nice to be reminded that I used to have
I'm sorry.
these. No, it's okay. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter at all. I don't think there was any need to say anything. I'll just say a few words before I go on to my presentation. It's now 40 years since I worked with sanitation. And I won't talk about sanitation because there's so much that I've written about it and so much that has been written about the projects that I initiated. My one conclusion is that it does not work and it is not going to work. Neither sanitation nor water. In the case of at least my country, Pakistan, and from what I read of what is written by the Indian scholars and the Indian cities I've visited, is not going to work there either. So there has to be some new way to get out of this, and especially with massive change and migration, the issues that we face today, especially environmental ones, are going to increase very rapidly. They already are. So I'll put this aside. What I'm going to present is not per se about sanitation, but it is about the issues that the pandemic has thrown up in the case of Karachi, and issues that we will have to deal with and make part of our policies in the future. Can I have my presentation? Is it anywhere?
Yeah.
If it isn't, doesn't matter. I can just speak. I mean, there are no images
Give
to
us
it
1 second.
anyway.
Yeah, just 1 second. It will be up.
So that is what I've tried to do, to show what new things have emerged because of the past 2 years of COVID. And okay, can I go? Okay. Can I enlarge this? Yes, I can. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And I just click and move. No.
Yeah, just tell us when you want to go to the next.
Okay, next slide. Next slide. Okay. Well, we've worked through 4 years now, and these are the organizations that I've worked with over the years: Urban Resource Center, Urangi Pilot Project, and various departments of architecture and planning. And the pandemic has reinforced the underlying of anti-poor biases in both official and non-official planning, maintenance, and financing processes. And the issue is really of anti-poor biases more than it is of anything else. And that, is, of course, is another argument that we can, if there are questions, I can talk about. Next. Now, Karachi's first lockdown occurred in February 2020, and the population was completely unprepared for it. And very rapidly, it ran out of food and money. And the civil society stepped in to provide food and money. But that was difficult to manage for a population of over 20 million. Now, so what they did was they identified community organizations which could deliver supplies, but that resulted in serious accusations of nepotism. Attempts to organize through temples, churches, and mosques was also problematic because their legitimacy was not accepted by many communities. And so communities developed their own rules of distribution, and it's very important to understand these rules because they differed from community to community, but mainly it meant that people with secure jobs, relatively rich entrepreneurs, and real estate owners were not provided with relief. Priority was for people who had lost their jobs, day-wage labor, small businesses, and those who had health issues. And the communities managed these remarkably well, which the state was not able to do. Other issues that surfaced was that there was no storage space for the large quantities of relief goods that made their way into these informal settlements, or kachiyabadis as we call them. And so food just lay out onto the streets. And there was not place enough for people to gather to receive it. Now, the other important thing was that government projects were all through smartphone apps. And the state was heavily criticized that, people don't know about these apps. And so, very sorry, but you have done something that is sociologically unacceptable. But surprisingly, when surveys were made, almost every house in an informal settlement had a smartphone. And there was at least one person in that house who knew how to use it. So COVID increased both the ownership and knowledge of using smartphones and the internet. And it was decided that this was an important aspect that needed to be developed, is to increase usage and increase the community's capabilities and capacities of using it. Can we go to the next? Then you had medical facilities and their problems. Mappings by us showed, I wish I had also put in the maps, but they showed that the major issue was that hospitals were at long distances from poor settlements, and immediate health care medical care was not available in the poor settlements, except from what is called clinics of quacks, for whom I have great respect, by the way. Hospitals ran out of with space for patients, and the government had to transform exhibition halls and warehouses and even museums into COVID care centers. The stage came when there were no beds or ventilators available for COVID patients. So the state immediately launched a massive program of manufacturing ventilators. And this has provided a lot of job opportunities and made us surplus in ventilators. And we also increased the COVID testing capacity. Now, there are a lot of private curative health clinics in the Kachiyabadis, but they have no association through which one could access them collectively and impart necessary paramedic training. This was one item, one thing that was pointed out by the medical profession again and again, that who do we talk to? We can't talk to everybody individually. There are hundreds of thousands, hundreds of them. The other thing that emerged was that because of COVID patients having priority, non-COVID patients were neglected, and there was no space for them in hospitals. Their death rate increased substantially. One positive factor was that Karachi has become a major exporter of masks, and this has provided employment to poor women at their homes. Much of Karachi's formal sector industry labor is on contract and has no job or social security. Accessing expensive health facilities is impossible for them. One good aspect of this has been that the contract labor has come together to try and fight for its rights, and has strong support from civil society. Well, the other things that surfaced were that Western medicine is far too expensive, and local medical systems should be promoted. I don't know if it is being done, but that has been argued again and again very strongly in the press and media. Can I go on to the next? You had major problems with SOPs. 62% of Karachi's population lives in informal settlements on 20 to 120 square meter lots. Their houses are anything from 2 to 5 stories high, and they house between 5 to 15 families, with sometimes 6 persons sharing a room and 20 persons a toilet seat in the building. Floor space per apartment average is 20 to 32 square meters. In these conditions, social distancing is not possible. The result has been that within informal settlements, people move around, but they cannot do that on the main roads because of the presence of police and rangers. They are used by the state to enforce the lockdown. In many settlements, adequate water for drinking purposes does not even exist, and soap and sanitizer are unaffordable luxuries. So hand washing and sanitation does not take place. There are some surveys for this as well. Religious gatherings in mosques, shrines, temples, and churches was banned and later allowed with social distancing, which could not be imposed because religion is sacred and above the law. So this is one cultural factor that makes it almost impossible to really ban for a long time religious gatherings. The motorbike issue was very sad because it was decided that only one person could sit on a motorbike, and that made life very difficult for households to do chores, to visit hospitals, to visit laboratories, to visit medical centers. And social distancing could not be managed in public transport, so the state in its infinite wisdom also banned public transport. And this led to the increased use of motorbikes and conflicts between the police and motorbike owners who wanted 2 people on a motorbike. So these are many of the aspects that surfaced, which have strong infrastructure issues related to them, which I will come to just now. Now, let's go to the next one. Education. The worst affected sector due to COVID has been education. University and higher level education is mostly online and manageable. School education is officially online, but the vast majority of students, especially the poor, study in government schools where there is no availability of computers or Wi-Fi. Students in households who own mobile phones struggle unsuccessfully to study online. A serious concern is that if this issue is not resolved in a period of another 2 years, we will have a generation of illiterates. Meanwhile, university graduates will keep increasing disproportionately and entering a rapidly shrinking job market. Next. According to government estimates, 1.5 million formal sector jobs have been lost in Pakistan. Independent economists say this is a gross understatement. There has been a sacking of part-time domestic labor. There have been some studies on this. Thousands of them have lost their jobs. Inflation, recession, and joblessness has reduced food intake, and according to surveys, is resulting in children's growth retardation. Karachi has a huge food industry, and its closure has led to large-scale urban-rural migration, which has created economic pressure on the rural households because money from the urban areas is not coming in, and only mouths to feed are replacing that money. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, issues COVID has raised. First of all, medical facilities and advisory centers are required at different locations. Necessary criteria and managing for them is urgently required to determine size, location, and function. Density-related building bylaws and zoning regulations have to determine the minimum number of square meters of livable space per person, and on that basis, densities per hectare. Maximum toilet per seat needs to be determined and imposed, and the space-related constraints for it need to be recovered. I see very little problem here because people want independent toilets within their homes, and this can be promoted, and space can be created in most cases, not in all cases, for it. Parks, sports facilities, religious institutions are all located far from low-income settlements. To access them, residents have to use expensive transport and cater to food needs of their children. If you have 5 or 6 persons in a family, this becomes completely unaffordable. And so you actually have people in many low-income settlements whose children have never seen the sea, although they are 14 or 15 years old. So there is something that is extremely important that has come up, is that there is a need to develop public space within informal settlements by turning wider roads into cul-de-sacs and pedestrianizing them, by locating nodes where trees can be planted and benches provided, leftover space currently used for garbage disposal. All these spaces need to be turned into public space. Then you have, which we have done in the case of Orangi in our work, converting parts of the natural drainage system with concrete roofing so that that space can be made available for sports facilities such as basketball. And if the community is involved in developing these spaces, then the community will also maintain them. The other thing we've already begun, which is a school and medical facilities mapping exercise, so that we can identify new locations to which people can easily walk or cycle. We also believe that a Wi-Fi cover for all lower and lower middle income settlements is required, along with training programs managed by communities for developing internet skills. We are told constantly that future planning must be pro-pedestrian, pro-street, pro-dissolved space, and pro-mixed land use. And changes in building bylaws and zoning regulations should be made. All our professionals lecture to us on this. But can this be done easily? This can be done easily for new settlements. But how do you do this for existing settlements where the majority of residents live and where such facilities are not available even in formally planned lower middle income and middle income settlements? The rate at which Karachi is growing will require 50 years plus before its spread can be 30% plus of its present size. Therefore, the issue is of the existing city and not of an imaginary future city, as is being presented at many webinars and lecture series. So we've taken this issue head on. Not that it's going to change, because people are allowed to dream, and so they can keep dreaming. These aspects, however, need research leading to changes, especially in annual development plan investments for low-income groups. Now, where will the manpower for all this come from? And how will it be developed in the future? These are questions that we will have to answer. There is a desperate need to identify the constraints in trying to achieve the objectives mentioned, that I have mentioned, and trying to understand also the constraints involved in removing the constraints. If we cannot do this honestly, then we cannot have a new infrastructure program that accommodates all that I have said. And then the question is, who will do all this and how? Then I think it's the last slide after that. Can I go on to that? To fulfill what has been discussed needs planning, monitoring, and documentation institutions. COVID has established at last that what Karachi needs is effective and independent union councils, which are the lowest rung of local government. Union council is usually about 75,000 to 150,000 population. There is consensus that the Union Council requires a trained architect, quantity surveyor, and a researcher. All these functions can be performed by an architect with support from a research assistant. But for this to happen, you need an architect who has been trained to perform these functions through a long association with communities, and you need a major shift in the training of architects, planners, paramedical staff, and the engineering profession, especially the engineering profession, because the engineering profession is fairly rigid. The architects don't know enough, so they can't be rigid. Now, this is a very important issue here. So where do you get these people from? Right now, many of the architectural and planning institutes who run these innovative programs, it's really, their students really engage in development tourism. It's not good enough. You need a much deeper understanding and a longer association. And more than that, you need a structure of thinking that frees you from a lot of subconscious prejudices, both political, ethnic, caste-based. That takes time, maybe another 2 generations. A grade 16 bureaucrat secretary to the Union Council also needs to be trained. The bureaucrat at the district level will also have to learn how to relate to an empowered council. Now for this, we have suggested for a long time, even before COVID, the need for the establishment of a municipal training institute to be established in Karachi, with the objective of carrying out research and training for bureaucrats at all levels on urban development and management, and making them acquainted. Right now, what happens, we have national institutions of public administration where people like me go and run workshops and give lectures to bureaucrats who are being trained or whose training is being upgraded, graded. You know, it doesn't really make much of a difference, although we find colleagues over there who are willing to work with us. But something much more is needed, something that can bring about a change in the structure of thinking. And here I emphasize that, the structure of thinking, because that is where the problem lies. That is where engineering standards are rigid. That is where greater emphasis is given by architects and planners on design than on management and subsequent operational problems. And what is very important is that we need to stop glorifying successful NGO and community projects, which are simply islands in a sea of increasing chaos and capitalist usurpation of the rights and properties of poor communities. I think this, again, we need to visit this. A lot of things have happened in the last 2 decades. I've been at it for 4 decades now. A lot of things happen. I think we need to honestly assess what it has been about. We have to discuss how the post-COVID period can deal with this, what I mentioned above. The Urban Resource Center in Karachi is in the process trying to understand what can be done and how on the issues above, and how it will affect future planning, especially drainage and sewage, where disposal points are disappearing for both sewage and flood water. They are disappearing because the small cities, small towns are becoming big cities, and the big cities are becoming urban regions, and we still deal with them as if they are what they originally were, with a similar manner of thinking. Then finally, I would like to say here that the world and Pakistan has changed from trying to become conventional welfare states to managing foreign-funded infrastructure and projects through public-private joint ventures. These concepts are little understood except at the highest levels and need constant articulation and discussion in simple terms. Thank you very much. This is all that I wanted to say. I feel that what I have said would bring about a considerable reassessment on how to approach the new infrastructure issues that are emerging. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. If right now if we would have been live, like in not on Zoom, but then in person, then there would be claps on the floor. So I would give claps. We have a question here. Moshmi Sharmin wants to ask, like, thank you very much for your talk. I have a query. Could you please kindly shed some light on social media in tackling the COVID in Pakistan, and how effective was it?
You know, I'm not on social media, but the people who work with me, they are all young, and they are all on social media, and they do nothing in their spare time except access it and write for it. I think it has been very important, especially where there were problems, to highlight those problems, to discuss them, to disagree with each other. But more than that, in the relief period, social media played a very important role. It put communities in touch with NGOs. It put them in touch with religious organizations who were providing relief. It put them in touch with medical doctors' organizations who were willing to go to their settlements to provide medical help. So that was very positive. But there was another aspect to what social media did. And that was that it introduced an element of accountability. The state functionaries were dead scared of social media. Whenever a campaign was launched against them, they came out apologizing, trying to justify themselves. So this has never happened in Pakistan before through the social media or otherwise also. So that was a very positive thing.
Thank you. And we have Nupur Soni, who has raised a hand. I'll let her talk. Nupur? No, I guess that was a mistake, maybe. Okay. No, Nupur is not there. Okay. I would want you to ask something with respect to Orangi pilot project.
Yes,
how
please.
how has it dealt with COVID? Was there any different scenario there, or because it has been much? I've read about it. I have not really. I mean, I would like to hear more about it from you.
Well, you know, the Urangi pilot project had a major impact on Urangi itself. Urangi is now about 1.3 million population. And I think almost all households have had some link with the project, mainly sanitation related. And many of them have gone through the process of collectively dealing with sanitation, raising money and building that sanitation, and dealing with government to provide certain aspects of the sanitation system. So naturally, they were better equipped to deal with relief. They were better equipped to deal with accessing political patronage. They were better equipped, and this is very important, to negotiating the limit to which SOPs could be imposed. For example, there's ban on 2 persons on a motorbike. Within that settlement, every motorbike had 2 persons on it. It was all negotiated. So these were simply because the communities had gone through this whole process of participating in development. That is why. So in that sense, it was different. The other thing was that the Urangi pilot project also led to the creation of other community organizations that do exactly the same work as the Urangi pilot project has been doing for 40 years, 30 some years. So these organizations played a very important role in mapping, in collecting money, in managing money. So this was the result of community participation in development that paid off.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Deliana has a question. Yes, Deliana.
Thank you. Thank you for I don't know, it was a simultaneously extremely depressing and extremely optimistic presentation. So I'm not entirely sure where I stand after this, but and allow me to ask you a question as an architect and somebody who teaches architecture. And I've been obviously wondering about this for the past year and a half. Where do we, what is our role in this? What is our role in the pandemic? What can we do as architects? And even more difficult, what can we do as architects based outside of situations where intervention is critical? How do we not fall into this trap of development tourism? How do we educate young professionals to understand the challenges and difficulties without being I don't know how to formulate it properly, but let me give you an example. We taught last semester and we engaged with sanitation in the so-called global south, and we were looking at issues that people are facing, particularly under conditions of COVID-19. And I thought that there was a moment of empowerment for students based outside of the UK at the moment who actually had their home contexts that they could work with and engage with and communicate to others, so that there was a feeling of we are working on an issue together and we are learning from the students who are at home in these situations. But I just wonder, how do you see it? what is your advice? What is your position? Like, how can we as architects act responsibly in these difficult conditions without falling into this development tourism, as you called it, trap?
Well, a lot depends on the architectural community as a whole, how it approaches this issue. Architects have patrons. And like in your country, like in India, sorry, our position is similar. The patron is the real estate developer. And he is the biggest crook who whitens the black money, as they call it, of the smuggler, etc., by real estate development. Now, and the architecture profession cannot do without him. The other patron is the rich person who builds a beautiful home, and the architect loves it because it gives him the opportunity of designing something that is beautiful, gives him the freedom of doing what he wishes to do. So both the ego and the pocket is satisfied. Now, it has always been like this. How do you break from this? I think that's a big question. And it's something that you can easily have a very serious conversation on, or a seminar on. In my thinking, if the architectural profession as a whole is able to develop some form of ethics and make it a part of the registration process of the profession, I think there will be a change. In 1983, I took a pledge, which I often put at the bottom of my emails, and which was basically that I would not do such and such a project, such and such a project, and I would fight against those projects that did all this. I have tried on different occasions that this should be a pledge for architects qualifying as architects, just as you have a Hippocratic oath for the doctors. The doctors won't practice it, and the architects won't practice it either. But at least it will be there. It will be a reminder that this is what you are supposed to do or not do. I firmly believe that a code of ethics is necessary. And that code of ethics is missing both in India and in Pakistan and in Bangladesh also. It is required. And then you need someone or a group of people or whatever, to prosecute those who violate that code of ethics. That is how change might take place.
Thank you. That seems like that should be done. Coming from an architecture background, an architect by training, I completely agree with what you're saying.
Not only by training, I also practice architecture.
No, me as a, I am also an architect by training.
You are also. Yeah,
okay. We have one more question, which would be my last one, by Kwang Hung. Thanks for your presentation. The COVID-19 pandemic has shown the role of technology in solving problems during the pandemic. And from that, in your opinion, in terms of limited capital, how investing in urban infrastructure in future will change? Will we focus more on technology and infrastructure systems directly related to health and epidemic prevention?
I cannot honestly answer that question. I think technology has played an important role, but we have not gone into really understanding as to how technology can be used to promoting awareness and in developing simple designs. We haven't gone into that. We need to go into that. The problem with technology is that it likes dealing only with complicated things. And very often I tell my students of what Buddha has said. Lord Buddha has said that ignorance confuses, ill intention complicates, and understanding simplifies. Technology has not taught us to understand as yet. When it does that, I think it has an important role to play both in design and in creating social awareness and cohesion. We haven't come to that.
Agreed. Again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now we move on to our second last speaker of the session, Sasanka Velindadla. He has more than 20 years of industry and development sector experience. Sasanka has master's degree in engineering and business management and has been working in sanitation sector for past 12 years. He has a wide-ranging experience in designing sustainability solutions for affordable housing sector, as an entrepreneur in solid waste management, and as an executive leading a non-profit organization. In the sanitation sector, Sasanka demonstrated business models for solid waste management, which were incorporated into policy. He has managed small-scale wastewater and FSM infrastructure projects across India and in Nepal and Bhutan. He has conducted feasibility assessments, managed design and engineering, devised business models and procurement strategies, and developed quality assurance manuals for wastewater and FSM projects. Sasanka has been part of team supporting Ministry of Drinking Water and Sanitation, Government of India. Welcome, Sasanka.
Thank you, Purva. Had I known you'd read the whole thing, I'd have shortened it quite a bit. But thanks anyway. Thanks for inviting me and giving me the opportunity. It's been very interesting listening to speakers before me, and to Mr. Hasan. I have only worked for a quarter of what you worked in sanitation, but there are moments when I do question whether I got into the right sector at all. So thank you for voicing those things openly. I do believe I'm much more sanguine about the sanitation sector than perhaps what your talk came across as, and for several reasons. It's the challenges are there, but definitely we have to look forward and see how we can tackle those. I do agree with you, though, that till people in general have a felt need for the entire chain from toilet all the way to the end of it, success will be difficult to achieve. It will still remain a challenge to get where we want to really get as environmental people. But the Indian government about maybe 12-13 years ago, I don't exactly remember, maybe 15 years ago, started building toilets in earnest, and I guess that phase probably has been a positive phase for sanitation in India, and it's continuing so far. Like Shubhagato mentioned in his talk, Swachh Bharat Mission 2.0, Clean India Mission 2.0 is getting started even as the pandemic rages on. And governments are working on the mission activities, even with the pandemic going on, although it slowed down quite a bit. So yeah, the challenges are there, and we just need to keep wading through those, I guess, as best as we can. But thank you so much. So like I said, the government in the second part of its mission has, I think, announced a huge set of funding for sanitation. Just give me a minute to share my screen. So there are a couple of programs that they have announced in parallel, adds up to quite a lot of money. There's about 40 billion for universal water supply and sanitation infrastructure in cities with more than 100,000 population. And then there's another 11 billion for the smaller towns, which have less than 100,000 population. But the interesting thing is that before doing this, during the transition from the toilet building phase to this phase, along the way somewhere, the government also announced a set of certifying criteria, or what they call as outcome-oriented infrastructure, in the form of ODF++ and Water Plus and whatnot. Basically, what the central government is now trying to do is to provide funds, encourage cities and states to take responsibilities, what Amita ji referred to as the Swachha Sarvekshan, the survey of towns and ranking, and having them compete with each other in some sense to gain prominence on the amount of sanitation or the service that they're providing. So between those kind of activities and well-defined or not so well-defined, whichever way you look at it, outcomes such as the ODF++, which says 100% of fecal sludge should be treated, or 100% of the wastewater should be treated, 25% of the treated wastewater should be reused. So they've given a set of goals that each city has to achieve in order to be certified in that manner. So between the funding and between the goals and between the awareness building through these Swachh Sarvekshan type of activities, there is momentum. Yeah, and this momentum is valuable to somebody like me, a practitioner on the ground, because, as I said earlier, sanitation is not a felt need. Most municipalities spend the most amount of their budget on sanitation, but they do it without any awareness, as people before me have pointed out. And so when awareness comes, you can at least hope for better decision making, more effective spending of money, and so on. And so that's why perhaps I feel a bit more sanguine in today's time than before, perhaps. So with that, I will jump in from here. The thing here that I really want to point out is this 50 billion or whatever humongous amount of money that's being pumped in is supposed to be spent in about 3 to 5 years. And it has never been done before in the sanitation sector by government. This huge amount of spending focused on sanitation. So the obvious challenge, immediate challenge is, will we be able to absorb this money and deploy it in a productive way? And what will it take for us to do that at a scale of about 4,000 cities that we have across the country? And of course, the same program is running in parallel on the rural side as well, which is 600,000 villages getting, again, a huge amount of money to do sanitation infrastructure as a follow-up to the toilet building program. So much money going into the system. Will decision making be effective? How will we approach the problem? So that's what got us thinking. And so this is a very practitioner sort of view. I don't have a the academic rigor to do this in a researcher's perspective, but it's just experience gathered over last 10, 15 years from me and my colleagues, more from my colleagues. So please indulge me as I go through a few of my ideas. So, I just learned that Johnny Miller took this picture because it is on the website, which is for this session. And coincidentally, it captures the primary challenge in sanitation in countries like mine, where cities have developed in such a way that there are huge contrasts, extremities of contrast standing right next to each other. So on the left, you have an informal settlement, very dense, most dense by some accounts. And on the right is a well-planned sort of development. So these two existing side by side in terms of infrastructure planning proves very challenging, right? If you zoom out a little bit, this is a different city, but of course, the same issue. What you see is the density of development is not the same all around. There are many gaps in between. There are islands which are, and also the other thing is the city not just spreads horizontally, it also grows vertically in fits and starts. The vertical growth is not very planned. It happens at random intervals of time in different spaces at different times, right? And that in itself is a challenge, even if there was sewerage network to begin with, which is the ideal in terms of sanitation infrastructure, at least so-called ideal. It still doesn't help when vertical growth happens, then the pressure on the infrastructure increases suddenly. So that is another challenge which happens. This is a different city again, a fast growing city. You see there are high rises coming up in the foreground, but then there are also a lot of different sized vertical developments all happening very quickly side by side. So the issues here, again, vertical growth puts a lot of pressure on existing infrastructure. Vertical growth creates islands of sanitation. Sometimes not very well managed islands of sanitation. So again, the water body that you see in the background is probably coming under severe environmental stress because of the growth of the city, right? A different facet of development. This is a mid-sized urban area. It is encroaching into agricultural land, raising many questions about the sustainability of our living style. But from a sanitation perspective, although you're part of a growing city, when you construct your house on the left side of the picture, it's an isolated house. You can't even expect the municipality to provide you with services that they would want you to have. And so you're basically on your own, right? In our cities, we do a reasonable job of providing power supply, but water supply and disposal of used water is all on you. And so this is one, the fringe of the town is always what we call the bleeding edge of sanitation, right? And then this is another type of small town scenario in India, which perhaps will never really grow into a big city, or it will grow very slowly. It will be surrounded by agriculture for the most part. But then it is such a neglected area for governments because small towns do not contribute as much in taxes. Small towns are politically not as significant as rural areas. And hence, till about 2-3 years ago, there was no mission or scheme and also like Shubhagato pointed out, urban sanitation was not given the priority that others were for some time, for quite some time. So small towns suffer from lack of focus. Yeah. And then there's a huge tract of India which is hilly, which provides tremendous challenges for a planner and engineer. Typically, this is Shimla in Himachal Pradesh, but most such towns have very poor infrastructure. The few that have been able to spend the money on sewerage infrastructure struggle badly with maintaining the infrastructure because the pipes, tend to break, and also it's very hard to do the sewage treatment plants in the valleys. Access is a problem, and so it's very, very expensive to do these systems. Typically, it costs about 4 times what it would cost an average system in a hilly area. So again, huge challenges. And the typical scenario in all of these places is you let the wastewater out into the valley, and whatever happens, happens, right? We've heard stories of people at nights emptying their cesspools into the valley once every 3 to 5 years or 10 years. They build huge ones right under their houses. And once the pit fills, then they empty it out into the valley. So a large tract of India has this kind of issue. So all of these issues, provide very contrasting sort of challenges for an engineer, a planner, even for the government. You have bulk generators, what we call gated communities, large apartments. You have all kinds of different situations where sanitation has to be provided. And in addition to those, there are the migration zones and the informal settlements and so on. If you zoom in and go actually on the ground, you will see that all these different scenarios have adopted these 5 or 6 different types of sanitation infrastructure. So there is the most ubiquitous single leach pit. It's one pit which is just soaking away underground. And there are septic tanks, large, majority of them, vast majority of them without any soak pits. They just overflow into the open drain. And so where a septic tank is there, usually there's an open stormwater drain. The open stormwater drains are euphemisms for stormwater drains. Actually, they carry wastewater for the large part. Even in the peak of summer, you will see some water flowing in the stormwater drain, which is the used water. And there are sewerage networks. About 30-35% of urban India has sewerage, and very little of rural India has sewerage. And large gated communities of which are beyond a certain size, which is about 2 lakh square feet of developed area, are mandated to have their own sewage treatment plants, which are called micro STPs. So because of regulation, very large developments have to have their own sewage treatment plants. But then there's a huge swathe of development between the single household and this large development, which can actually be considered a bulk generator of waste, where multiple housing units reside in one building, maybe 10, 20, 30, which are not regulated to have their own STPs. And so they are stuck in this in-between scenario where they're too big for a septic tank or a soak pit, and they're too small to be able to afford their own sewage treatment plant. And for the most part, what these folks do is they have a hole in the wall, the peripheral wall, through which a vacuum suction truck can put in their pipe, and once a week or once in 10 days, empty out the tank and go dispose somewhere, where nobody's watching. So a large part of India ends up, 65%, 70% of urban India and most of rural India ends up emptying their pits and disposing it informally. And so that is the reality on the ground, right? And this is on the problem side. I'll now show you a couple of pictures. I'm sure you're familiar with a lot of this. You see the ubiquitous open drain, which accepts all forms of waste, passing across the households, in front of the households, carrying wastewater, which is a human exposure risk. What you do not see is what is underneath the toilets or underneath the house, which is the pit, which accepts the toilet waste. So in a large majority of the scenarios, toilet wastes are contained in a single pit. They are not let out into open drains. For the most part, there are exceptions, of course. And so these open drains, they're bridged across for functional reasons, and they carry the waste and by gravity to the nearest surface water body. And that's what's happening. You see the challenges here. This is a recognized settlement, recognized slum area in Delhi. The challenge here is people were even ready to invest and put in sewerage network in the place, but it was very hard to figure out where to put the sewerage network. If you dig such a narrow street to the depth that the current specifications expect you to dig for a sewerage network, you would start affecting the foundations of the houses. And so that was it was a challenge. In the middle picture, you see the exigencies of not having space. So you build privacy suites on top and dispose directly into the stormwater drain, which is right underneath the wash area. So these are some of the more difficult sort of situations. And these are situations where infrastructure is already developed. So a vast majority of the sanitation problem in India is a legacy problem, right? It's a retrofitting problem. And so the local context has to determine the response. And the challenge with responding to the local context is the capacity to respond, the nuanced understanding of what sanitation means, what the infrastructure means, is lacking at the local government levels. And so how do you deliver that $50 billion that we identified at the beginning? How do you deliver that to this place in a coherent way? And that's the challenge. Right. So you see a lot of the existing infrastructure can be mapped this way. The black water, which is the toilet water, typically goes to, in a small percentage of cases, direct discharge, majority of the cases to a single pit toilet. A good chunk of maybe 25-30% twin pits, another 20% maybe septic tanks. In urban areas, about 30-35% sewerage, and then very small amount of marginal percent to open drains, right? But that's the gamut of current infrastructure that's there. And then the other water, the gray water, so-called, from laundry, bathing, and kitchen, that goes in the open drains mostly. Where you have sewer networks, of course, it's all the black water and the gray water together go into the sewer network. But elsewhere, it's either going into an open drain most of the time or discharged directly. In very few cases, there is a soak pit associated. So if you look at this from a risk perspective, each piece of infrastructure has an associated risk, which is very instructive to understand, very intuitive to understand as well. Most of the time, the pits affect groundwater, whereas the drains affect the surface water and then the groundwater. But the drains and the septic tank without soak pits, these actually cause surface drain human exposure at the surface. In some ways, the Indian government has tacitly acknowledged that the balance between cost of providing sanitation infrastructure and the risk associated with poor sanitation is perhaps best answered through the twin pit system, right? So they have tacitly acknowledged, this is nowhere mentioned formally, and this is just my surmise from what they have done, is that the twin pit provides the best balance between cost and risk. And so, taking the risk of groundwater contamination where groundwater is much lower, water table is much lower, and it is not such a big risk, is probably the de facto acceptable practice across the country today, right? And there are clear instructions and guidelines on when not to use the pit toilet, where high water table, flood areas, those. But when it comes to execution, those instructions are followed patchily, right? So given that the government has tacitly acknowledged that we are willing to take some risks, it's not going to be the perfect solution, and cost and risk have to be balanced. Looking at the further problem from that lens, the post-toilet problem from that lens, opens up many more solution opportunities than the conventionally preferred sewerage system. Now, I did not point this out earlier, but the $50 billion that was allocated there, I think if you look at it per capita for sanitation purpose, it's about $100 per capita, or some $300 per capita, or something like that. A small amount in the context of sanitation infrastructure. And so it's a given that we will not be able to provide the sanitation services to the entire population that needs it through this allocation that we have right now. And so that also pulls up the question of what is the priority, right? Now, before these schemes came up, Shubhagato and my other colleague on the panel, Kavita, and a few other partners in the sector have been working very hard to demonstrate fecal sludge management as a solution, where we empty out the soak pits and treat them properly. Kavita will talk more about it in her presentation, I'm sure. So I will not dwell on that. But in a resource-constrained environment, that kind of approach, which provides basic sanitation to all, is perhaps more preferred than spreading the money thin and not solving the problem even at a basic level for many people. So that is the other insight that we have gained in the last 5 years, which hopefully will be practiced now going forward. Now, stepping to the solution side, again, for the last 10, 15 years, this is what's been happening. When we started, I will go a little fast now because these are all familiar sort of situations. We started with solutioning for well laid out communities where it was easy to sort of provide these services. And we thought slowly we will be able to learn enough that we can scale and do a much better job of it. After having done that for 9 or 10 years, we realized the problem is way too big, and the rate at which we were going, it was nowhere close to what is required. So then we started looking at city level applications of decentralized treatment, and with some degree of success, but nowhere close to being able to saturate a city with these sort of solutions. Now, along the way, the learning definitely was, though, that the contextuality, the response to the local challenges, all of that, how do you reuse the treated water? What is the best case scenario for reusing treated water? Those were all learnings that came through as we went along. But the ability to cover an entire formally planned municipal area with cost-effective sanitation service was still a challenge and remains so even today. right? Now, as we went through these, around 2013, there's more of the same, where agriculture and protecting the water bodies. So around 2013, 14, we started looking at, this is too slow. How do we do 100% basic sanitation for everyone? And that is when, fecal sludge management came through. Again, protecting water bodies, intercepting drains and protecting water bodies. So when we looked at fecal sludge management, obviously it had its own challenges. How do you empty? Access to emptying, very difficult, because the houses are, the toilet pits are way in the back of the house. But these are all, legacy issues which we need to deal with. On the bottom, the picture on the bottom that you see is a slight improvement, where there's a inlet pipe that is already pre-fit with a cap, so that it's easy to access the septic tank directly, or the single pit in this case directly. So through these learnings, we were able to implement 1 or 2 or 3 fecal sludge treatment plants, where the immediate problem of disposing fecal matter, which is about 70% of the fecal matter running around on trucks, so that we demonstrated. And as the journey went on, what we realized, it's captured in this graphic, is you need a multiple solution approach in every city, responding to the context, the specific context of that locality or ward or whatever unit that you want to take up. So in this graphic, whatever you see in the core business district, that is centralized sewer network, hopefully a legacy network that is protected from further pressure of vertical development through regulation, which says that if you are beyond a certain size of households or population, you have to have your own STP. The tallest building in the city should have its own sewage treatment plant. Then there are smaller pockets of development, IT parks, office buildings, so on and so forth, which should also have their own sewage treatment plants, for the simple reason that they can afford to do it, and they should not pollute their surroundings. And then those that cannot afford, those that rely on pits and septic tanks, the marginal populations can be provided the service of fecal sludge management. So basic takeaway from the whole thing was multi-solution approach to sanitation infrastructure is critical to be able to reach everyone equitably and provide them the level of service that can at least guarantee public health at the minimum, safety, dignity, public health. And in the process, if we can protect the surface water bodies from direct pollution, then that is great. So that brings us back to the basic question. We have now a lot of money. We know what we need to do. We need to provide a multi-solution approach to every town in India. How do we then do that, right? This is an example of Bangalore, where it has embraced a lot of this multi-solution. The experiments have been done there. You can see a wide variety of these experiments, and different cities have these demonstrations. Bangalore is one good example. Now, when we approach the problem of how do you then plan for a multi-solution approach, one of the first things is, of course, the cost of these systems, right? And understanding the costs of these systems helps in choosing the right one for different locations, depending on what is affordable in that location. So lifetime costs of various technologies, you can see a stark difference between nature-based systems, which have a much lower lifetime cost than mechanical systems, and understanding the difference and the implications of the difference to the sustainability of a system is important. Also understanding what people can afford, like Mr. Hasan was saying, the builder will only build the cheapest system available. because they do not have to do the O&M of the system. That's for the people who live in the building. So there is a split economics which creates perverse incentives. And those kinds of issues have to be dealt with through regulation. That is what that is showing. Now, if you crystallize all of that into about 3 or 4 possibilities, these are possibilities. And from here, let me be very frank and honest. None of these possibilities should be presenting itself as the solution or the approach. There is no such thing so far as we can understand. We're still learning and evolving, but broadly grouping them into these kind of solution approaches. So there are 4 different solution approaches with the different costs. As you can see, the costs are indicative, but you can see why I was stressing on fecal sludge management at 250 rupees per capita, or about $4 per capita, being something that is amenable to scaling up fast and providing that basic public health and environmental cushion rapidly across the country. And then the knock-on benefits of that on the other pollutants is also something which we need to measure. Sorry, am I out of time? I can quickly close.
Yes, sorry, but it just
no
like
problem.
last
Thanks
1 minute.
for letting me know.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm almost done. So the basic premise of what we are trying to do is to come up with a decision tool which helps city planners and practitioners prioritize the different solutions that they have available to them. So it has about 5 simple questions, and starting with the density, which makes sewerage affordable or not affordable, and space availability, water consumption, and so on. I will not go into the details of it. Anyway, it is quite a bit of work in process, needs to be validated with different cities, but the approach is something that in the short run, with the pressure of doing a mission of such magnitude, these sort of approaches we feel will hopefully improve the decision making, if not make them, they will not make them perfect, but perhaps smoothen out some of the rough edges. So these 5 questions, and you get some answers. And then there is also a follow-up to that, which is the decision making at the hydrogeological level, more technical aspects of that. Again, work in process. So to close, basically the experience has been that we need multiple solutions, but it also has been that to adopt these multiple solutions, we are not yet ready from the engineering, technical, social capacity, financial side of it. There are no guidelines on how to put in a simplified sewer system. If you want to put a sewer system, you have to do it 1.5 meters below the surface of the ground. Otherwise, it's not accepted technically. So we need guidelines to change, specifications to change, the standards to evolve. And finally, we need tools which will help us all make the right decisions. I will stop here. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity again.
Thank you so much. I know everyone will have a lot of questions. I have many of them, but I'm going to move to our next presenter because we are really, really lagging behind. We're not good on time. So hold on to your questions or put them in the chat box or Q&A box, or we can have a discussion after our last speaker. So we move on to our next speaker, last one for this webinar, Kavita Wankhade. Her work primarily revolves around urban service delivery and interface between physical infrastructure and socio-economic dynamics. Kavita has worked as a researcher, project manager, educator, and has built her expertise through a rich mix of field research, managing complex projects with multiple stakeholders, teaching and training. She has engaged with various state governments in India, multilateral institutions, and with public sector enterprise in the UK. Some of her recent research and consultancy projects have included the review of urban sanitation sector in India and in India that contributed to the development of National Urban Sanitation Policy 2008 and also impact assessment of JNURM in selected urban locations. At IIHS, Kavita is a senior lead practice. Recently, she leads Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Support Program that is working to establish 2 model towns in Tamil Nadu, as well as enabling statewide scaling up. Kavita has managed an international curriculum development project at IIHS with a team of over 180 leading academics, practitioners, and policymakers from across the world. Welcome, Kavita. The floor is all yours.
Purva, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Before I start, just want to make sure my screen is visible, right?
I am not able to see it. It's just a black thing.
Oh, okay. Now?
No.
No.
Oh, that's strange. I'm sharing my screen. So let me try again. 1 minute. Now?
No, I can just see a black screen.
Okay, I'm doing the same thing. Do you mind then sharing it? I had emailed it.
Yeah.
Sorry about this, but I did the exact same thing before the session.
No,
And
it's here. It's here. We can see it.
okay, you can see it. Okay, fine.
Yeah.
I'll
Yeah.
just make it yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks for that. So you can see it, right?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, Kavita, I just shared my screen, so please let me know when you need to.
You shared my
to the next slide. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you can go to the first slide. Thanks. You can move down. Yeah, thank you. So sorry about that. So thanks to those of you who stayed till the end. It's been a long webinar. I also want to thank all the panelists before me. It was very interesting to listen to what they said, and they've kind of built the context for India, most of them starting with Amita, and of course, Shubhagato and Sasanka have made my life easier because they've explained some of the things that are happening. So like Shubhagato and Sasanka, I also work on fecal sludge management, and I worked, Shubhagato told the story of Orissa. I'm going to tell the story of another state in India, Tamil Nadu. But my approach is slightly different. I'm going to actually take you through what we did so far, what we've achieved, and what were our failures, and what have we learned. And this is much more from a perspective of working with the government and where we went wrong and what worked, right? So just to give a context that we started off in 2016 almost, so it's 5 years of work, and you'll see that there is substantial movement in urban sanitation, and of course there are gaps of what have been done. And to say that this is about saying that my own positioning, I was part of leading this program called Tamil Nadu Urban Sanitation Program, and that actually set up a technical support unit supporting the government of Tamil Nadu in a way. So my perspective from where I'm presenting is somebody who was embedded within the government, but obviously not part of the government. So just to make clear of where my positioning is in this, and the modality of how we work was also that we set up an advisory committee on sanitation broadly, but specifically on fecal sludge management, to work to scale urban sanitation through the state. And that advisory committee had government, but also other relevant stakeholders on that committee to take decisions for the state. We started working off on a few towns and very quickly scaled up to entire town. So that's where it was. And the government was very clear, and that's where my focus of the presentation would be. They were actually not interested in piloting in 1 or 2 towns. They wanted it to be a statewide scale out. In fact, very conversely, given other projects that are done by the government or funded by bilaterals, we in fact explicitly told the government that we will not be working in Chennai, which is the largest metropolitan, saying that if we work on Chennai, we're not going to be able to work on other towns. So that's the context. If you could move on, please. And I think that's an animated slide. Yeah, I'm sorry, you just have to click. Yeah. So this basically, I think I'll not speak too much about it because Sasank has explained it, but I just want to say that this is essentially a full cycle of sanitation. So access or toilets is first part of it, and then it has to be transported either through trucks, which is water fecal sludge management, and then treated, or it's done through pipes, which is sewage. And the reason I'm putting it up here because earlier there were some of the questions that were posed to earlier panelists was what about public health benefits? And the point I want to reinforce there is that looking at this full chain, right from access, and of course access is important and remains very critical. It's not sufficient if we want to address public health issues. And also it is not sufficient to address inclusion and exclusion issues, right? Because if you're looking at manual scavenging, if you're looking at gender issues across the thing, we really do a disservice to even inclusion issues if we just focus on access. Hence, our focus was on the full cycle. Next slide, please. So again, I'm not going to repeat now. I think you all know fecal sludge management. Our focus was on fecal sludge management. And the reason for this was very simply, like Shashank said, that the government realized that it's an economical thing to do. And their thing was that for larger cities, we have sewage systems which will be complemented by FSM, but for smaller towns, there's no way, even if the states were to put in the capital investments required for that, they will not be able to meet the operation and maintenance costs. It was also a quicker way of reaching out to urban poor and other locations. And I just want to say that often we talk about inclusion and exclusion stuff of urban poor communities, which is important, but also there is a whole exclusion that happens in terms of small and medium towns. They just do not get services, and that really affects the health of the entire town, right? And it's also about, there are legacy problems like Shashank showed, but that's also the thing that you already have part of the system in place. And what you need to do is now improve upon it and close the cycle. And as you can see, what we were talking of 664 towns, so big corporations, which are million plus towns, but also like really small town panchayats, 500 town panchayats, which were maybe 10,000 population or so, which we were looking at scaling. Next slide, please. So when we started off, one of the decisions that was taken was that we would demonstrate this as an approach in 2 different kinds of cities. So there was Trichy, also known as Trichopalli, which was a million plus city, and see how fecal sludge management would work as a complementary thing to existing sewerage networks, right? And we worked in 2 town panchayats. So these are really small urban local bodies. And like I said, there are 500 of them, and where fecal sludge management would be demonstrated as a standalone approach. I'm just going to explain 2 technical words here because otherwise you get lost. So when you have a sewage network, you don't need to build infrastructure. You have existing sewage treatment plants where you can actually also take waste from pit latrines or cesspools or septic tanks, and it's called co-treatment. But for places where you don't have a sewage network, you need something called FSTP, fecal sludge treatment plants. So just wanted to explain that, please. Next slide. So when you start looking at things, you start looking at what are the gaps, right? And there were many gaps here. I'm not going to go through these because these have been articulated by earlier speakers. Could you just go down? It's animated. Yeah, just 2 more, 1 more. Yeah. So, but you know, we also have to look at what are the strengths. So first of all, there was open defecation and access issues in Tamil Nadu, but a large number of urban households actually already had a toilet. There were issues of it being shared toilets, community toilets, and all the problems were there, but it was not as big an issue as it would have been, say, 20 years back, right? But there were 2 more interesting things. One is that the state already had STPs, which were actually underperforming. That means they were not receiving enough waste. They were consuming energy and not receiving enough waste. And the third and the interesting point was in Tamil Nadu, because of, I am not an ethnographer, so I don't know the history, but I'm guessing because of the history of self-respect movement and all, you had people who were manual scavengers, but who had managed to raise themselves in the profession and who were now actually operating small, informal desludging vehicles, which meant that they had trucks instead of manual. I'm not saying manual was eliminated, but unlike many other states, you actually had a private sector, informal private sector of desludging operators who were already there. So we had these two strong points. And they actually, when we talked to them, said, we are being penalized by the police and the government for going and dumping waste in the open. We don't have enough treatment facilities. Now, because unlike many states, there was already this strength available for the government, the treatment or having facilities was a starting point. The reason I'm saying is because I, as a professional, have always said that infrastructure is not the thing that is important, but service delivery is. But in this specific case, you had other parts of the chain, but till you got your treatment facilities in place, you could not kind of move the entire system. So that's why that became the starting point. Next slide, please. So in this, there are lots of numbers, ignore them, but basically what the government did was did a phase-wise investments. And I want to just say that 2-3 things. One is that the first 2 phases were, like I said, co-treatment, technical term, but just remember that this means the facilities were already existing and we had to add minimal capital investments to make those facilities work for truck drivers, desludging operators to come and dump fecal sludge, right? So you made use of existing facilities. Second, we went by a cluster approach and said one facility, whether it's a new plant or an old one, will serve a more number of towns, right? And the reason is because Tamil Nadu is highest density. We talked to the operator, the business model worked on distances. So within a distance of say 10 kilometers, give and take a few kilometers, you could have one facility like a spoke and hub model serve others. So that's why if you look below, there are 41 STPs serving 69 towns. So one facility treated multiple towns. And the third point really is, if you look at there are huge numbers that have been allocated by the national governments in the last few years. But what our selling proposition to the government was that put this amount of money, it's a very small sum of money. You want to put sewerage networks later on, that's fine to do, but you put this amount of money, and essentially what one could do is achieve 75% of population coverage. This is urban, this is not rural, right? And what you could take to the state, the government could say that within 2 to 3 years, you could, because the other thing about FSTPs is that the infrastructure, if you get it right, is easily created in 6 months, to a year if you delay. So just keeping that in mind. Next slide, please. After that, again, we're being cognizant of time, just that what happens when you start scaling, right? So you standardize the process as much as possible. And I will come to the negative side of it. But what we did was give 3 or 4 type designs, give modular designs of different sizes. And the government then had we prepared checklists, we prepared different kind of support material. And then we did training for government officers and for the private contractors who were building it along each step, right? I'm not going to go into the technical stage, but as you can see, support was provided through the period. And in fact, we were anyway developing an online dashboard, and that really came in useful when COVID hit, because we were able to review things remotely. And when I say we as a TSU and also the state government sitting in Chennai was able to remotely monitor what was going on different sites. Next slide, please. So after treatment was over, the next was how do you maintain these facilities? And here, that's where we wanted to operationalize the cluster model. So what the government has done is there's an MOU which is signed between different clusters of ULBs. And essentially the agreement is that we're calling it the host ULB, where the facilities there is actually able to contract out to private sector to manage these facilities, and the cost is borne by all the 2 to 3 to 4 ULBs that are there in the cluster. So it's a cost sharing arrangement. This has two advantages. One is that these facilities are located in bigger municipalities, which means the smaller towns which do not have the capacity. And I think this lack of capacity was mentioned by all panelists. And when I say lack of capacity, I don't mean that people don't have the technical skills necessarily. It's just that the government is doing too much. They're overstretched. So it also means that larger municipalities with larger staff is able to manage these facilities and provide services to others, and they are getting return. Secondly, even for the desludging thing, there was a lot of back and forth between the government and us where, the thing to do is to put a price cap, put a price ceiling, streamline them, do some kind of regular desludging. But we've taken a contrarian approach and said, and we have to yet to see how this works out, but saying that there is an existing system, it is working, the prices are reasonable for most people. So let the market function as it is, with obviously inputting things like safety clauses for safety, worker safety, etc., into this standard license agreement, and then provide specific subsidies or lower rates for the urban poor, which the urban local body tackles. And the reason why we did this was because you don't want to go in and disrupt an existing market, which is of informal players. It's not that these are big players, they're small players. But the more protocols and the more regulation you put in, all likelihood, it's the informal sector that gets pushed out. Next slide, please. So the key to all of the above was, getting institutional buy-in from the government. And it served different purposes. So I would say capacity building in terms of let's build capacities doesn't work, because it's not always according. It's very easy to say that the government is not interested. It's easy to say the government doesn't have the capacity, and it may be true off and on, but they are also constrained by many things, right? So first of all, they've got to believe it. And I think Shubhagato spoke to this, sewerage was seen as the only solution. And it was till we organized a visit to some of these FSTPs, one of them actually done by CDD, which Shashank spoke about, that they saw these systems function. And we also organized trips to Southeast Asia where some of these were working, that they started having a belief that FSM could work. And once that worked, then our job was made much easier. And then obviously we had classroom training and digital blended learning given COVID. But again, the point I want to highlight is these were not standalone training programs. So when the government rolled out FSTPs, there was a series of training around what was being done, right? When the regulation was being rolled out, there was a training that was being rolled out. So the officers were not being trained on something which they would do the training and then have no mandate, no capacity, no mandate to implement it, because that system was not there to allow them to implement it. So training went along with other things. And lastly, we also trained other people, and I'm going to come to that in the next slide. Can we go down, please? So this is the point. I think when we talk about sanitation, of course, our primary role was to work with the government, but there are many, many players involved, right? There are NGOs for community workers, there are small informal desludging operators that I spoke about, there are private contractors, the SHGs, and one needs to engage with all of them in different means. And I'm going to talk about two of them. If you could just click, there's an animation. Yeah. So one is capacity building, which I spoke about, but let me just take two things. One is FSTP construction and operation. Again, here, there is a prevalent thing that we should train private sector, right? But when we went and talked to the private sector, one has to be very realistic about who are the private sector players who are going to come to the market, and are they interested, and what is it that will get them interested? And I'm just saying this because there's one line of thinking which says that the private sector will solve all the problem. There's another line of thinking that government just needs to open up. But we've also seen, even in a state like Tamil Nadu, which is one of, I would say, has engaged with private sector more than across sectors, but it's not necessary that the private sector is willing and lined up and ready to jump in. In the case of sanitation and FSM, for them, the market was too small. And the smaller players who were ready to come in, didn't have the capacity or didn't know how to enter this market, right? So there are a whole set of complicated things around it, which one has to understand and work around it, work with it, rather than saying, let's do capacity building, or let's just take position that let's do private sector, right? And about desludging operators, I've again spoken, but I just want to say that I don't have the space and the time to talk about safety, but safety remains a very critical issue, and we've done an in-depth work on occupational safety. And again, like many other things, our key learning of occupational safety is it is not about providing the equipment. It is not about providing the PPE kits. Those are one things, but one has to understand what is it that sanitation workers really will get them to use it. For example, they've not found, we had to tell, okay, what I meant to say is that it's not just about, it's not simple. It's not about giving them set of PPE kits. There is a deep issue there around their own vulnerability. And we've had tough time working with them to first understand why they were not willing to use it. And there were very valid reasons for not using it. And then actually put processes in place which help them to use it. It's no point in trying to blame them that they're not using it, which is a narrative with the government. So that was on safety. Can we move down? So work again with SHGs and strengthening of women desludging operators and other women professionals through the chain. Again, that's a whole area, different area of work, so I don't want to go into it, but there are these issues, and these are much more difficult than what I've described earlier. And we are still learning to figure out how to strengthen women professionals across the chain, etc. And I just want to say one point, because Amita referred to it in her first presentation about shaming people and behavior change and communication. And I think that's absolutely right. And what we have tried to do instead is create this friendly character called Kakaman, and Kaka means shit in Tamil, and basically use fun and openness to talk about sanitation with people. It's early days. I don't know how far it will work, but being very conscious that there is no negative messaging about sanitation, because we've had enough of that, you know. And so let's make it a topic that affects us, that affects our life, and let's talk about it in a simple and an educative way rather than, you know, trying to shame people through it. Next slide. So, Apurva, do I have time, or I have 2 more slides?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So failures. So remember, I talked about 2 pilot projects, FSTPs, and then I actually didn't speak about it. The thing is, they failed. The first one is a classic NIMBY Simran. There was a land and due diligence was done by us, by the local body. And then it ran into community issues. And it's a complicated story, but it's not as simple as saying that the community was not consulted. They were. And I can't unpack the whole story, but there were also other things of real estate developers coming in, the perceived value of land going down, etc. And that land went into litigation. And I'm just saying this, that no matter what you do in an urban area, since this larger theme is urban, your urban land related issues are going to be pertinent no matter what. Second is private sector. So this photo that you see on the right hand corner is an FSCP that finally got built. But it's a very funny story. We had an international advisory group to advise us on select private sector. We wanted to get in new technology. We had multiple rounds of screening. It was supposed to be the best process ever. And we went through it, and it took a lot of time. And then midway through the project, the private sector guy ran away. I mean, I don't know any other way to put it. There was a whole complication, and that person went away. And then we had to really, luckily we had some other partners who stepped in, and we had to rejig it, and now the plant is working. So where does this leave us, right, in terms of failure? So one is very simple. It doesn't solve the NIMBY problem. The government decided to do something very intelligent. They said no more of this. It allowed us to fail earlier and learn lessons. So the government said there are solid waste management sites which we have. There's extra land in this. FSTPs take less land. We'll go and locate here. This does not solve the NIMBY problem. That's a real issue, whether it comes to sanitation or solid waste in the cities. But it's been solved temporarily for this program. Second is about private sector. So this raises the question of private sector, because right now it's very fashionable to say it should not be based on what is called standard designs. There should be space for innovation. But the point is, how much risk can the government take? And in this case, I think the government rightly decided that we are trying to scale something new. FSM is new anyways. We cannot now be innovating on technologies, having only a few vendors show up and then have a whole mess. So they decided to go in for standard design, which is what I had shown you earlier. That was not the original plan. So my thing is, when you try scaling something and you want to do it a particular way, it doesn't always go like that. Our current challenge is O&M. The story I presented to you is still construction. How it will pan out 5 years down the line, what I will be presenting in 5 years' time is unknown. So I'm just putting it out there. And on the right side, just very quickly, some of the, I think, learnings. One is an outcome focus is very important. And I'm speaking this from this being a donor funded project that between the government and us and the donor and other stakeholders involved, a lot of our assumptions got changed on the way, like whether it was the private sector, whether it was capacity building. But the consensus had to be on outcomes and an agreement on that for the program to go ahead. Second, the focus was on scale. And I think the government was very clear that do not give me a pilot that works in one city, because that's not going to happen. We need something that focuses on scale. Now, this did lead to compromise, which I'm going to come to on my last slide. But that focus was very clear. So we did simple things, compromise on certain things, but it meant that things could move. Third and the fourth point are related. I would say that I think changing mindsets, getting government to take responsibility in whatever way, at whatever level, is very important, rather than going and saying that the problem is lack of technical capacity. That may be true, but I think getting people to accept a particular, I would say, approach is much more important. And the last point, I really haven't had time to speak about it, but that's kind of where I come from and my work comes from, is really having an interdisciplinary team of sociologists and behavior change specialists, as much as the engineers and planners really helped us. If you could go down to the last slide. Just it's animated. I just want to couple of things. These are, I would say, more of provocations. I don't have the answers to this, but things that I'm questioning at this point. One is that institutional buy-in can happen, is happening, like we are saying, but we have learned that you can only push 1 or 2, 3 things at the time. And that is to do with governments, no matter whatever critique one has of them, there are many things. And, we may be talking about sanitation, but they have X number of things to do. And we can push in only 1 or 2 things at the time. And which is why, in a way, and Sasanka and I have debated this in other forums also, complex planning where we are trying to get 6 things across. I don't know if that works at scale. It's a question mark. All of these are question marks. Second, the priorities keep changing. So you have to kind of find a way into that. But so how much do you change, don't change. The last point on this institutional buy-in is that institutional reform is important. We all know that there should be municipal strengthening. We all know that XYZ should change. But as a program, and even from the government side, as an advisory committee who is responsible for delivering result, where do you draw the line between saying, we're going to do this and going to achieve this outcome, versus saying, this is fine, but we also need to change XYZ in the process. I again don't know. I myself don't know the answers. The second point about scale versus complexity, and I've already spoken about this, is that once you're scaling, sometimes you have to do things in a very standardized way. Now, this means that some of the ULBs on the ground don't have a choice. Now, is that a good choice, good or bad? I do not know, because yes, I agree with the principle that each ULB should be able to select. But when the capital funds are coming from the government, is that really going to be viable? And that leads to my second question. Urban planning or planning at urban scale, does it really work in the context of India's federal government right now, right? Because the devolution was supposed to happen. It's not happened as of now. Most of the funds lie with national and state governments. So how is planning at urban scale going to work? Because the cities I'm not talking about the metros here. The metros are fine. If they have money, at least the 4 or 5 metros, top 4 or 5 metros. How are the other cities going to work? So are you really going to implement at city, or is it better to start with the state and roll it out from there? And last is private sector. I think, again, private sector is seen as a solution to many things, at least among the professionals and the world that I come from. It's unclear, whether they'll get in capital. We also don't know whether the big private sector will step into sanitation. There are efforts to do it, but we do not know, because fecal slide management, as you see, remains a very small pot of money. So that's a good thing and that's a bad thing for the private sector. And there are huge issues of even good private sectors who are committed to make some change, not walking into this because with the government, well, government has its own issues. So these are just kind of some, I don't know, my provocations and my unanswered question after 5 years of trying to implement this program. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita. We have already overshot on time, so I'm going to shut up and not ask questions. But if we have some questions from the audience, I would like to take them like as soon as possible, or quick questions. If not, I will wrap up the session because it's really late in some parts of the world. I would like to thank all the panelists. Okay, there's one question from Mr. Sasanka. We have heard about the centralized and decentralized approaches for water management. Was there also a disintegration between the government levels in adapting and implementing the plans, or national government? Okay, it's answered, I think. Okay, great. It's answered. So I would like to close the session and thank all the panelists and everyone who joined, especially given the craziness which is going around all of us. Also, all the recordings are available on INFRA YouTube channel. Once again, thank you for joining, and hope to see you all again on the session on the 1st of June, which is another session on fictions and infrastructure.